learning how to reframe challenges has a powerful metabolic effect on your brain. What else could explain, maybe super agers, actively challenge themselves just because they have so much energy. And so they're just always challenging themselves. But it seems to me that that would be a great debate to have. In the end, was this person so happy and thriving all through their life because they kept actively challenging themselves or because they had energy to do it? Well, maybe these two just have to go together.
Welcome to another episode of The Golden Hour. I'm Rashad Badr here with Dr. Kevin Majors. Kevin, it's great to see you again.
Hey, Rashad. Great to have you back too.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's been a while since we've done a podcast together, so this is exciting.
You've been growing the business for Optimal Work.
Yes, I have, fortunately.
Yes.
But it's good to come back and do these sorts of things. It's fun.
Yeah.
Kevin, so let's jump into it. Both you and I think, read a very interesting book recently. It's a book called Brain Energy by Dr. Chris Palmer of Harvard Medical School, and he's at McLean Hospital as well. I think he holds a number of positions there. He's also a psychiatrist. And I first heard about Dr. Palmer and his work on a different podcast. Truthfully, I don't readily recall which one it was, but I remember he told the story of one of his patients. One of his patients had a serious mental illness. They had been struggling with a whole host of issues for a very long time. And so Dr. Palmer had tried various medical interventions. Because of these interventions and these drugs, this young man had put on quite a bit of weight and wanted to lose some weight because he wanted to, find a girlfriend and all the other reasons one would want to lose weight. And so they had tried a number of dietary interventions, some of them with mixed success, but then they ultimately got to the keto diet. And once they had started this diet, Dr. Palmer started to see an extraordinary improvement in his patient. And it wasn't just in weight loss, but he noticed that at both 2 weeks and then later on at 6 weeks, there seemed to be a marked improvement in some of the sort of psychiatric symptoms associated with this young man, or the symptoms that this young man was experiencing. And that led Dr. Palmer, I think, on a sort of journey to understand why. Why was this happening? Why do some treatments work for some? They don't work for others. Why was this diet effective? So on and so forth. So I offer that just by ways of a scene setter, but why don't you give the audience the broader summary of Dr. Palmer's work and the sort of general trajectory of the book?
Yeah, the book is an overview of metabolism and mental illness. So it's an extremely big topic, and it can get really, really messy because metabolism has all these different features. It's your diet, your environment, your history, how much you exercise, and lifestyle factors, and all of this stuff goes into metabolism. So it gets really hard. What is developing now is a better science of understanding mitochondria and then seeing the connections that they have to anxiety, depression, and every other psychiatric illness. The basic idea of the book is that there is a complete overlap between metabolic disorders and mental illness. And so the overlap means that in people who have badly functioning metabolisms, like say with diabetes or other cardiovascular risk factors, they also have more psychiatric symptoms. And more now evidence has been accumulating that show the role that mitochondria play in different mental illnesses. So I remember, I've been saying probably for when did I first hear about it? It's probably 10 years ago that the idea that in particular bipolar disorder is a mitochondrial disorder. And at the time, I liked that explanation of it because working with people who had bipolar illness, it didn't feel like it was that psychological to me. I didn't think that there was a direct thing where there's a cognitive distortion that they were struggling with or simply a bad mental habit, but it felt very physical. And since mitochondria are how your cells create energy and utilize energy, unlock it for themselves, is where metabolism really takes place. It made sense that if your cells aren't properly functioning, if the mitochondria aren't properly functioning, you can have disorders of too much energy or too little energy. Uh, and so, anyway, I've been really interested in this area for a long time. I think it was 19 years ago. I gave a grand rounds at UT Southwestern on the ketogenic diet to treat bipolar disorder.
That's
So
amazing.
trying to, yeah, and at the time, no one really had. It was just like in the infancy of it. I didn't invent the ideas that they're based on what was in the research at the time, but it still wasn't really that well known. But now fast forward 20 years later, and you have a book like Brain Energy, which in some ways is all about what can you do to intervene when people have an unhealthy metabolism and their mitochondria aren't functioning well to get their mitochondria back.
Wow. So I love that story, Kevin, of how almost 2 decades ago you had done a talk on this with the ketogenic diet and bipolar disorder. One of the reasons I found this book so compelling, let's start off with maybe just some of the basic survey work that Dr. Palmer did, and then we can talk about how much of a, a paradigm shift this may or may not reflect. And I'd love at some point to get your thoughts on sort of, do you find his argument compelling in this presentation? Uh, Dr. Palmer talks about, I believe it's in the second chapter, he talks about signs, symptoms, and syndromes. And so when we use certain language, whether it's anxiety disorders, depressive disorders, ADHD, bipolar disorder, what have you, we have in our minds, I think, a mental model that these things are uh, relatively enclosed in a box. But Dr. Palmer talks about how that may not actually be the case. And maybe the language that we've used may have misled us somewhat in our understanding. Would you care to comment on sort of this model of signs, symptoms, syndromes?
Yeah, I think the main thing to understand in that discussion is that all psychiatric disorders are syndromes. And by a syndrome, you simply mean a conglomeration of physical signs that you can measure, that there can be, what physically measurable things, and then subjective symptoms, what the people are complaining of having. So, an example historically of this is AIDS. So, we knew that there was this acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. All we knew was happening was that there were people getting these rare cancers and unusual infections. And then you would check, and here there is a massive deficiency in their immune system. So, hence acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. Then it didn't take too long, but it took some time. And then we figured out that there is this virus that's causing it. So, when we have a syndrome, we can study something, we can look at treatments for it, but we don't yet know exactly what's causing it. So, the idea is it's a placeholder that we work with that then lets us come up with not just treatments, but also eventually understanding the cause and then coming up with ways of preventing it and so on. So, right now, then, when it comes to psychiatric illness, we don't have the knowledge we need to say what exactly is the cause of it. Um, what I found to be one of the most fascinating things in the book is the study of rats that were anxious. And then do you remember that part? The
Hmm.
nucleus accumbens?
Yes.
'Cause I think
Yes.
you texted me at one point asking, "Hey, did we ever talk about the nucleus accumbens?" So, but there are so you have these rats that they would study rats to see who were the most anxious rats. And you can kinda tell, because, um, they're, an anxious rat will hug the wall of the cage it's in and not venture into the center. A beautiful word is called thigmotaxis. So, they get highly thigmotactic, and it's researchers love having these complex words, but it's like they like pressing against something, and that's a measure of anxiety, and then the amount of time that they're not in the center of the cage. Anyway, so they can select out the most highly anxious rats, and they were able to show in the nucleus accumbens of these rats decreased, fusion of the mitochondria. Your mitochondria should be able to move around, and they should be able to fuse with each other. Mitochondria are I should say what they are. They're intracellular bacterium. So they're the first organelle that cells ever had, and they're capable of communicating with every organelle, working with every organelle, moving around, joining each other, changing shapes. It's a complete universe that these mitochondria do. We used to think that the nucleus of a cell was the important part, like the smart part. It seems now like the nucleus is essentially like the hard drive that your mitochondria use. Like, that's what they where they pull up things that you need. Now we need this protein, now we need that. They essentially just they're able to control the expression of genes in the nucleus. So and we used to think, so much they're not just the energy cells, like the batteries of your cells, but there's something much more quasi-intelligent about them. Not that they're actually thinking, but everything is about energy in the end when it comes to cells and how they function. Any rate, so they found that there were defects in how the mitochondrial work in the highly anxious rats. And then they could give them, through a virus, something that would correct the defect, and the anxiety went away. Those rats also were highly depressed, and because you can measure depression with forced swim tests and also how much they like saccharin, the taste of saccharin, and that also normalized. So that actually points to a causal thing that there can be that at least in anxious and depressed rats, that it was causal. They just segregated out the highly anxious one and then came up with a treatment that got rid of it. So that's pretty amazing, and it's very recent. Just showing that there is so much, that depends on how well the brain is functioning, and that really comes down to how well the mitochondria are functioning. So if your mitochondria are healthy, then the neurons can function at their best. But if they're not, your neurons have a hard time. So that's really one interesting piece of evidence.
And to connect that with the signs, symptoms, and syndromes discussion, one of the things that I found extraordinary in the book is that Dr. Palmer talks about how if anxiety or depression were caused by some other issue, whether it be cancer or illness or something like that, that sort of root illness is treated. And the psychiatric component of it may also be treated as sort of like a secondary treatment, but they understand what the sort of contributing cause or the main cause is in that instance. But the psychiatrist, such as yourself, you're left with everything else, right? Like if there's no clear or known cause, which is really an amazing thing because you have no clear diagnostic measure, at least how Dr. Palmer talks about it, of any of these other things that you're wrestling with. And so to draw the connection to the point that you made about the metabolic health and the mitochondria, now we're seeing this common pathway amongst all of these other things that may have been labeled syndromes before, which we had perhaps thought of as separate things. But in reality, Dr. Palmer's argument, if I'm understanding it correctly, is in fact, these are all sort of perhaps expressions of some underlying metabolic dysfunction and concern. Um, and and to the point that you made also about the mitochondria, I think it's funny. I just have very vivid memories in high school um, of hearing about the mitochondria, and I think that anyone within I think a certain age range of me like would remember this saying. It's the powerhouse of the cell. It's the powerhouse of the cell, and I was like, I'm not even sure I know what that means, right? But in its fullness, and it turns out that it's more than just the powerhouse, right? The argument here is that it plays a much more compelling argument or a more compelling role, I should say. So with that, Kevin, I mean, this is a good point to sort of stop, and I just want to get your pulse on this. How compelling do you find this? Right? Is this something that, as you see the argument come together, that says, "Yep, this is something that I've intuitively thought," as you had mentioned earlier on, or perhaps Dr. Palmer may have taken a leap too far because in the book he's quite open that this may actually be a controversial set of positions that he's advancing.
Mhm. Yeah, and Douglas Wallace is the researcher who posited that all neuropsychiatric diseases are mitochondrial diseases. So, which is a very interesting claim, to be making, that basically everything that a psychiatrist or a neurologist really, but especially when it's neuropsych, that these things are mitochondrial in their nature. Uh, so, but then what would we even do with that? Okay, so let's say that it's true. The danger would be then people would think that the only thing that matters is mitochondrial health. Now, it's clear that you can influence your mitochondrial health through your behaviors. It's not as if mitochondrial status determines behavior. In fact, behaviors play a role in determining mitochondrial health. So, the number one thing that you can do to increase the health of your mitochondria is exercise. So, the simplest treatment for most psychiatric conditions that makes an impact on quality of life, I'm not saying it cures the thing, but it does cause a significant increase in the quality of life, is just regular aerobic exercise. And then maybe resistance training has a role to play too, but undoubtedly. And that's one of the things that exercise does is by placing periodic demands on the mitochondria in your body, it ends up inducing something called mitophagy, where the underperforming mitochondria in your cells get recycled and you get the birth of mitogenesis, you get the birth of new mitochondria. Then your cells are much more capable of giving more energy bursts in the future bouts of exercise that you have. Well, that's a great explanation. So, and in some way, could that also be what's happening in the brain when we exercise it? Why is it, for instance, that when you look at superagers, so people whose brains are completely resistant to neurodegeneration, that one of the main qualities you see in them is they continually actively challenge themselves. So, continual active challenge for the brain is like exercise for the body. Now, probably exercise helps some mitochondria in your brain too. So, I'm not saying these are like totally tight compartments, but actively embracing challenge is for your brain something that also would then likely, you could say, improve the health of your brain's mitochondria. And in fact, that's a characteristic you see of so-called superagers. I was just talking to the patient about this morning, but there is an article in the New York Times. So if people want to look it up, just look up New York Times superagers, and you'll see the discussion of a study that is fascinating. So I think the what we can do ourselves, to improve the health of our mitochondria is manyfold. There are studies, for instance, of uh, mothers of autistic children compared to mothers they're like matched with mothers of neurotypical children, and then looking at collecting various times a marker of mitochondrial health. The cool thing again about mitochondria is that you can do a blood test and look at how it's generally white blood cells or mononuclear blood cells, but it's mostly white blood cells. You can look at their level of mitochondrial functioning, and it's a good proxy for the rest of the body. So there's something called the mitochondrial health index, and that can assess the state of mitochondrial health. And they found this that when mothers got to the end of the day with a good mood, that correlated with then like for the next few days having higher mitochondrial health indexes. So there's something where, and then on very stressful days where their mood was very low, they had lower mitochondrial health indexes. But that might show that you can have a kind of bidirectional causality. That what if we could help those mothers who are under periodic intense stress with autistic child? What if they could be reframing? What if these challenges were something that they were finding beautiful? I'm sure that many of them do. But just to say, is there anything we could do psychologically to help them to thrive on that challenge? Undoubtedly there is, because we're all human. And so we can all be helped, by friends and loved ones and others to thrive on challenges. And the more support they have and the more, help they get and encouragement they get, well, it makes sense then that it actually is impacting their mitochondrial health as well in a measurable way. So it's interesting. There's a mitochondrial marker you can check that is responsive to mood.
We talk a lot about mastering one's attitude at optimal work, right? And I think that was one of the parts of the book that I also found so extraordinary. Because if we talk about mitochondrial health, when I first read it in the book, I had thought to myself, okay, this is something on a physiological level that sort of circumscribes what we talk about. We, of course, talk about reframing, mindfulness, and challenge as sort of psychological and social elements. And we talk a little bit about the physical things, right, that sort of underpin it. But my initial thought wrongly, was that this is something that's going to be like, okay, these are going to be sort of like marginal points, like enabler points. But then, as you had mentioned, it's worth mentioning that in addition to exercise, Dr. Palmer also talks about sleep. And then he also mentions this ketogenic diet, although the book was not at all about a ketogenic diet. It was much broader, light therapy, things of that nature. But then, as you said, behavioral therapy, embracing challenges, all also had impacts on the mitochondrial health as well, which is really quite amazing. It's an amazing insight.
Actually, yeah, one of the funnest also things I learned in the book was transcranial photobiomodulation, shining a bright near infrared light into the brain through the nose actually improves depression, and because it improves the functioning of mitochondria through in the brain. So it's a crazy study, but there are these. You may have heard, like, some gyms now have red light therapy that that people get recharged. There might be a real science behind that, of red spectrum and near infrared actually being your mitochondria are sensitive to that kind of that wavelength of light, and they get charged by it. So there's a lot of benefits people get just from being in the sun. And it does seem to have to play a role in charging up your mitochondria, but you can deliver it through these devices, through the nose into the brain. That's totally fascinating.
Maybe that
I'm
should be a
sorry.
new business unit for us, optimal nose laser. Um, but when I thought about this as well, I thought about a number of the different, let's call them, you know, uh, customer segments, if you will, different industries that we work with, industries that I find prone to burnout. I think physicians are very prone to burnout. I mean, a lot's been asked of physicians in recent years. I think teachers, same thing. A lot's been asked of our educators. So those two come to mind immediately. I'm sure that there's other, hard charging, let's call them attorneys or consultants, also prone to burnout. And um, what's compelling about this is to say, actually, in addition to all these other things, working on navigating your attitude, working on reframing, cultivating mindfulness, and then actively challenging yourself can change you. There's a physiological correlate to all of this. It's not just a set of thought patterns that one can actually stretch themselves this way.
I think that reframing mindfulness and quality challenges that are meaningful are going to be found to be the most effective interventions that people can take in the moment. Now, exercise is great, but you can't always do it in the moment. And ketosis is great. I mean, it is like a common feature of almost every story in the book that at some point they try the keto diet and then there's these incredible effects. And I have recommended the keto diet to people that I've worked with and seen phenomenal results very fast. I don't know if it's just some people are very sensitive to, but sometimes even when meds don't work, and that people could be having significant trouble sleeping or not sleeping at all, and meds being very hard to manage it, and then the keto diet does it. So I've seen remarkable things just recommending it. I almost sometimes wonder if it shouldn't be just the first thing people try. Try it for 10 days, and try to be really good about it and see how you feel. Because the keto diet is a mitochondrial intervention. It changes the metabolism of the body in the most profound way. So anyway, I find that very interesting. Fasting is a mitochondrial intervention. So intermittent fasting also does, just like exercise, helps you to clear out your mitochondria. So just to say, there are like powerful interventions we can do at the purely biological level, but I still think uh, that it's not simply that we have a low mood because we have poor mitochondrial functioning. But I think that's the other way too. That learning how to reframe challenges has a powerful metabolic effect on your brain. What else could explain? Maybe super agers, actively challenge themselves just because they have so much energy, and so they're just always challenging themselves. But it seems to me that would be a great debate to have. In the end, was this person so happy and thriving all through their life because they kept actively challenging themselves, or because they had energy to do it well, maybe these two just have to go together. And what we have control over is actually reframing mindfulness and the active embracing of challenges.
Amazing. Well, I hope in the event that Dr. Palmer listens to this, I hope we did his work justice and that we offered a fair synopsis of it. I thoroughly enjoyed the read. I mean, I thought it was a really a great book, and so if anyone's listening to this, I'd highly encourage you to check it out. He's also become more prominent on the internet as well. He has a number of presentations and podcast appearances, and so I think that that's great.
Yeah,
But
he has a very long interview with Andrew Huberman, so on Huberman Labs, and I think in many ways, I think it took a lot of courage for him to put this all together and to come out because psychiatry is slow to change. And many times, people who kind of go out on a limb, they find there's a lot of opposition. And Dr. Palmer has shown us that we can talk about these things in a way that isn't trying to have a one size fits all solution, but instead trying to show an underappreciated facet of our lives.
yeah, yeah, you seem to take a very sensitive approach. Well, I think this has been a wonderful conversation, Kevin. It's a good sort of reentry into the podcast. Do you have any parting thoughts before we sign off?
Uh, well, I would only suggest that people stay optimistic about your ability to engage challenge. Try to see that you can do some things to shape your attitude and your attention and your actions, but then keep also a kind of spirit of curiosity and study to read books like Brain Energy, to try to see like what can you find that works for you that really does so you get to I think everyone can get to the point where they feel like they're thriving on life and challenges. And if you're not there yet, it's okay. Keep it there as the goal. That some of the most severe illnesses that people have ever had have gotten better as people have applied themselves to these approaches.
Beautiful. All right, Kevin. Thank you so much. It's been great. We'll be back next week.
Well, thanks so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Don't forget to check out optimwork.com for a set of online tools to help you engage challenge in your life. See you next week.